resistance and movement, which shifted political focus back to the country's largest economic sector, the agriculture, which was left voiceless and disregarded for decades. It may be time to rethink rural agrarian India again. Social anthropologist Mukulika Banerjee's new monograph, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, is a study of the relationship between political democracy and active citizenship in rural India, particularly West Bengal. Namita Waikar is a writer, journalist, and a translator. She is managing editor and co-founder of People Archive Rural India, a multimedia journal and archive committed to covering and building a database for contemporary rural stories. In conversation with academic and writer Badri Narayan, they explore the democratic values and notions of agriculture that shape the country's political landscapes. Mukulika Banerjee is a professor at LSE and was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Center from 2015 to 2020. She has published extensively on Indian democracy and Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India is her brand new book, published by Oxford University Press. Namita Waikar is a writer, translator, and author of the novel Long March. Walker is currently working on a non-fiction book on the farmers' protests, forthcoming with Melbourne University Publishing. Badri Narayan, social historian and cultural anthropologist, is the director of GB Pant Social Science Institute, Allahabad. Besides having written a number of articles both in English and Hindi, he has recently authored Republic of Hindutva, Fractured Tales, Invisibles in Indian Democracy, and Women Heroes and Dalit Assertion in North India, among others. So, ladies and gentlemen, Agriculture and Roots of Democracy with Mukulika Banerjee, Namita Waikar in conversation with Badri Narayan.
Welcome all of you in this session. We are going to begin this session and my panelists suggested कि इसको हिंदी इंग्लिश दोनों मिला के बनाया जाए इस सेशन को. It should be more engaging. और I'll begin with a promise by you कि आप इसमें सवाल भी करेंगे और आपको जवाब भी मिलेगा. So it should be two way, not one way. So let me begin with the session with a sentence. People used to say, culture is the basis of the agriculture, but we say agriculture is the basis of culture. Without agriculture, no culture. So, and without agriculture, even no politics. So, without agriculture, no democracy. But what happens? Always, जो agriculture है, वो हमारे कैमरा गेज में नहीं आता, मीडिया कैमरा गेज में, लेकिन मूवमेंट्स चलते रहते हैं इधर उधर. पहली बार दिल्ली में इतनी बड़ी जब दिल्ली में प्रोटेस्ट हुआ तो कैमरा गेज को उसने बाध्य किया और स्टेट को भी बाध्य किया. So you can understand the power of the peasant, power of the agriculture, which is the basis of the politics of democracy in India. We have two very eminent panelists, as our coordinator of the session introduced. Mukulika ji, eminent academician, who works on culture and village and the democracy, agriculture and democracy. And Namita is organic intellectual who works with the community and write for the community. So we have a very interesting panel. So first of all, Mukulika, नहीं, नमिता जी, sorry, नमिता जी बोलेंगी. और पेरिफेरी पर पिजन मूवमेंट चलते रहते हैं, हमेशा चलते रहते हैं, डिसेंट्स होते रहते हैं, लेकिन हम ना रिकॉर्ड करते हैं ना डॉक्यूमेंट करते हैं, बट ये लगातार उसको डॉक्यूमेंट करती हैं. तो वो उस नुएंस को आपके सामने रखेंगी नमिता जी।
Thank you, Badri ji, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all of you for being here on a topic that is not always very popular, but which is very critical for our nation. My interest in rural India and agriculture began when I was researching to write for my novel, The Long March. And having always been a city girl, rural India was new for me at that time. And it was during that research that I got in touch with some rural journalists, including Jaideep Hardikar, who is here today, and he has a session tomorrow. And also P. Sainath, eminent journalist, who is the founder of People's Archive of Rural India. And it was during this research that I traveled to some villages in Vidarbha. And also it was at that time that I got involved with PARI, People's Archive, which is an online journal and archive, ruralindiaonline.org. Now, the farmers that PARI writes about, the stories that we tell, are about farmers not from privileged backgrounds, but they are from the underprivileged background, the small and marginal farmers, the landless agricultural laborers, the Dalit farmers, Adivasi farmers, and most importantly, the women farmers, who are very unfairly kept out of a lot of benefits because they don't have their name on the land, and it's the landowner who gets the government's benefits. So according to the census of India, actually, anyone who tills the land, anyone who cultivates a land is called a farmer and is eligible for benefits, but this is not how it works in practicality. And the Dalit farmers, besides their decades-long being deprived of social and economic equality, they also have to bear the contempt of caste hostility and of the local power setup, which has a certain contempt for them. I would, lend the mic to Mukulika or Badri, and to take this discussion forward. Thanks.
The way agriculture, we nurse our agriculture, we nurse the plants, we also need to nurse our democracy. And Mukulika works on that, how people in non-political time, in a everyday time, they deal with the politics and democracy, how they deal with the democracy, how they nurse democracy in their everyday life. So may I request Mukulika to respond on that.
Thank you, Badri. I'm going to, this is the book I'm going to be drawing from. Unlike some other panelists I've worked with in the past, I'm not going to continue to hold it up. I'm just going to put it down, and I hope you will remember to go look it up in the bookshop. Before we start, can I ask how many of you here have actually spent any time inside a village? So I know what kind of audience we're talking about here. Fantastic. That is great. That's more than 70% of the audience. And what I'm trying to argue here in this book is that we say it like a rote, India is a democracy, we live in a democracy. There are several levels of complacency about that. The first level is that 75%, as Badri said in his opening remarks, 75% of the country actually lives in rural India. What's happening to democracy there? And I argue rather counterintuitively, usually when we think about village India, we think village India is the place where you develop fantastic philosophical ideas elsewhere, and then you give it to village India. Villages are meant to learn how to be civilized, how to be democratic, how to become citizens of a republic. And what I'm arguing on the basis of 20 years of going back and forth to the same village, thinking about these issues, is that actually village life produces the philosophical ideas that are germane to democratic thought and practice. Now, this is not how we think about it. So when the Constitution of India was being written, for instance, somebody like, say, Ambedkar, who had had a horrible experience as an untouchable child in a village where the caste discrimination was extreme, where he couldn't drink water from where all the other school children did, and the family left and never returned. So Ambedkar was similarly, was understandably quite colored against what a village stood for. Nehru similarly, on this one issue, Ambedkar and Nehru were actually quite in sync about it. That famous formulation of Ambedkar of the village being a den of vice, of being ridden by caste, that this is where there was inequality, and that somehow the emancipatory potential of the Constitution was going to change Indian society, including Indian villages, is the idea that stuck. But there was a whole other section of opinion in those constitutional debates, of which Gandhi is the most prominent. But there were several others, like Radha Kamal Mukherjee, there was Harold Lasky, who was a professor in the LSE where I teach, and other Indian thinkers who said, no, we must localize power. And they lost out, that group. So ever since that, the inheritance, and what I think we want to bring across in this panel, that we are really, all three of us are arguing against, in the first instance, that the village is unsuitable for democracy, and we need to transform the soil of the village. Now, if I can say one more thing on this, what Badri's already highlighted the idea, he's given you a taste of it, is that I use the word cultivation. Cultivating Democracy is the title of the book. I use the word cultivation because I say, it's only somebody who's tried to grow something that understands in order to grow something, you can't be complacent. And you may not, of all of you who've been inside a village, how many of you have actually grown a crop from beginning to harvest? Okay, so there are much fewer hands, there's about 6 hands. If we had longer, I would invite you to talk about it. But one thing I know from having spent time in a village is that you can't have weekends if you're cultivating. You can't take time off. You can't say, oh, I had a late night yesterday, today I'll have a late start. You can't do that. And you are constantly on edge about how the crop is going to turn out, too much water, too little water, pests, weather, all kinds of things can go wrong. And I say that it's that kind of vigilance that a farmer has towards their crops that we as citizens need towards democracy. And I can elaborate this later. Thank you.
Namita, I have a question for you. We are saying kisan, 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 but now our Prime Minister is saying, पहले हम कहते थे किसान के बेटा प्रधानमंत्री बनेगा. अब चाय बेचने वाले का तो that shift, there is a shift in that. ये going more down. Second is peasant. बहुत हम लोग बात करते हैं कि गांव भारतीय गांव, भारत गांवों का समाज है, गांव का देश है. बट आपको पता है अब धीरे धीरे अर्बनाइजेशन फैलता जा रहा है. 75%, 69% पे आ गया है और भी नीचे चलता जाएगा. तो और पीजन पे स्टडीज कम हो गए हैं, रिसर्चेस कम हो गए हैं. अब तो पहली बार ये जो मूवमेंट हुआ तो अध्ययन शुरू हुए, नहीं तो बहुत सारे एकेडमिक जर्नल्स में पीजन पे आर्टिकल्स ही नहीं दिखते थे. तो पीजन का ये जो मार्जिनलाइजेशन हुआ है वो क्यों हुआ है? और क्या अभी देखिए पूरा इतना बड़ा मूवमेंट हुआ और यूपी इलेक्शन में देयर वाज नो इको ऑफ दैट मूवमेंट. तो ऐसा क्यों हो रहा है? मुझे लगता है आप ऑर्गेनिक इंटेलेक्चुअल हैं, आपने काम किया है, यू कैन रिस्पॉन्ड ऑन दैट.
Yeah, thank you, Badri. And taking off also a little on what Mukulika has just said about the time that the farmers have to spend on the farm. Recently, I was in a village in Karnataka and I asked one of the farmers I met there, his name is Organic Mahadev Swami. He calls himself that because he does organic farming. And I asked him, how many hours do you spend in a day or a week or a month? And he said 24/7. That's the amount of time we need to spend. And these are the people who actually know all the nuances of what agriculture is about the season, which crops can grow when. Not only that, they also know about what it takes to see a crop through the entire season, through the year, through different crop cycles, and how to nourish the soil, etc. And these are the people that were completely left out, you know, when the farm laws were passed, as they were passed within an hour in the parliament, without consultation with a larger community, without consultation with farmers, without consultation with women farmers who do so much of the work on the farms. And what were the laws about? You know, there were 3 laws which they call the Kale Kanun, which have now been repealed, but in some states they have been implemented. If you're going to do away with markets, if you're going to bring in contract farming, which anyway is already in existence, and you're making an amendment to the Essential Commodities Act where you say that big corporates can hoard grain and sell them as and when they like, it's going to impact the livelihoods not only of farmers but of all Indians, because that's going to have an impact on everybody when the prices rise. And the decision making of all the processes in farming are more and more being taken by corporates, or even the agricultural universities everywhere. You know, the people who are part of the boards that rule these universities, they are all formed by big corporates who have, and the research laboratories actually work for big companies, which then use that research for their own products, whether it's crops or pesticides or anything else, or fertilizers. So where are the farmers in all this? You know, their decision-making capacity, their right to, the democratic right to participate in this decision-making, that has been taken away. It's as if they don't have a voice, when actually over 70% are present in rural India, and many of them are dependent on the agrarian economy. Not everybody is a farmer, but a lot of other occupations, the people in other occupations, they are dependent on the lives of farmers. When farmers don't have money, the weavers, the carpenters, all the other professionals, they suffer, and then they have to migrate to the cities, along with farmers who lose their lands. There are other laws, you know, which impact the farmers. And at the protest site in Delhi, there was a farmer from Varanasi district. He was a small farmer, barely 1 acre of land. And he said, you know, हम उगाते हैं, खेत में उगाते हैं, लेकिन अगर मुझे कहीं और जाना है काम करने के लिए, because you know he doesn't get enough money from just that farm. मुझे काम के लिए अगर जाना है तो बेटे को या बहू को कहना पड़ता है कि तुम अपना काम छोड़ो और खेत की देखभाल ही करो, because the stray cattle will otherwise come and destroy the crops. So why have the stray cattle been let loose? I think we all know, because of the cow slaughter ban, that it's difficult to move cattle away from the crops. So these are the different laws. It's not only the 3 farm laws, but a lot of different laws, the policy changes which changed, you know, after the 1990s, diverting, say, water from the rural to the urban, from agriculture to industries. All these policies also impact the lives of farmers and the lives of people in rural India. Thank you.
मुकुलिका, मैं आपसे 2 सवाल करना चाहता हूँ. एक तो ये आप कहते हो विलेज एंड डेमोक्रेसी का गहरा रिश्ता है. गांव में तो डेमोक्रेसी शब्द कोई जानता ही नहीं है. जनतंत्र पूछिए, कोई भी नहीं बताएगा. तो कैसे वो रिश्ता है और उसकी अपनी भाषा क्या है, अपना डिक्शन क्या है? दूसरा, एक हमारे गांव में कहावत है कि बड़ डर बघवा से कि टिपटिपवा से, यानी बाघ से डरते हो कि बारिश के बूंदों से डरते हो. वैसे ही मैं पूछना चाहता हूं आपसे कि किसान बड़ी की जाति, कौन बड़ा? किसान की जाति, यानी किसान एज ए क्लास. जाति ने, अभी उत्तर प्रदेश में आपने देखा कि जाति ने किसान को तोड़ दिया. तो इस बारे में आप अगर रिस्पॉन्ड करें तो मुझे लगता है ऑडियंस को जी.
Thank you. What great questions. On the second one, I don't agree. You know, for anyone who doesn't follow Hindi, the second question was, what's the relationship of farmers and caste? And we've seen in the UP elections, Badri claims that we've seen that caste arithmetic has triumphed farmer solidarity. And I disagree with that reading. Absolutely, I think the farmer identity has been subsumed under not caste identity, but a different kind of messaging by the incumbent government, by the BJP, which has made people think. We were talking about Rashtravadi here, right, yesterday on this stage. I think it's a different kind of narrative. Anyway, that's by and by. But you know, the farmers' protest, just to link it to what Namita was saying, these 3 farm laws and the 12 months of protests that we saw, they were almost an exemplification of what farmers are capable of in terms of putting on protest, you know, a democratic protest. It is now the longest non-violent protest in independent democratic India. And it, you know, I don't know how many of you went to the borders of Delhi to see the farmers' protest sites. I was very lucky. I went on the day that I happened to be in Delhi, the day the laws were repealed. So it was a wonderful atmosphere. And like all of you, about a dozen of you have been there. If you saw them, there was this incredible resilience about living through a whole agricultural cycle of winter and summer and terrible weather and rains. And yet there was discipline, there was organization. And what there was, and this is to link to democracy, Badri, is there was the ability to create solidarity. There were libraries, book langars, where people were donating books and people could come and read. And every day we met this man who used to, it was just like an open room like this, a tent. And he had some books and he said, शाम को 1 घंटे के लिए लोग आते हैं, बैठते हैं हम ऐसे, और जिसको जो बोलना है बोल सकते हैं, एक माइक्रोफोन है. लोगों को सीखना पड़ता है कि बाकी लोगों के साथ कैसे बात किया जा सकता है, अपना परिचय देना, सवाल करना. These things are things that you learn to do to act politically. And everything they had in them as farmers equipped them with the right values. Now, what are these values? I don't have very long. I can give you a couple of examples. One is, let's just talk about Jativad and being a farmer. In a village, you know, in my book, I talk about 4 key events in a village. Not to say that they are the only 4 key events. I have just chosen 4 events. So from politics, I have chosen an election. But from religion, I have selected the ritual of Qurbani, you know, of Eid, when you sacrifice cattle. From the realm of kinship, I talk about a sexual scandal between 2 young people and what happened and how that was resolved. And then from the economy, I talk about the harvest. Now we talk about, you know, den of vice. Remember, I was telling you, Ambedkar's the village is a den of vice is an image that all of us work with. It's a village. That's how we say it. They're backward. They believe in caste, as if in cities we don't have caste. As if in cities we marry people from across the caste. Do you know what the figures are in India at the moment? More than 85% of 20 to 35-year-olds believe that they should marry within their caste. The young generation, this is not some parents telling them, this is them. So this is how we behave in cities. So just to, you know, underline that fact. But when there is a harvest, and you know, there are half a dozen people in the room who worked with their hands on a field, you will know that the harvest, when the crop is ready in the field and you need to cut it, tie it, transport it, and then send it to the mill or the market or wherever you're going to, this cannot be done by one person. You can do lots of things in life alone. You can't do a harvest on your own. You need people, right? Am I saying anything wrong of the people who've worked? Mohit, you're sitting in the front, I can see you. You can't do a harvest alone. When you are bringing in a harvest, you know, there are 20 fields of varying lengths. They're smallholder farmers, they're not big. And you have to organize this. Who are the people? Who do you think are in charge? The people who know how to run labor, organization of work, bringing materials, time flow. And it is never the upper castes, because the upper castes own land. It is the people who were the sharecroppers, who are the laborers, there's somebody smart, they are the ones calling the shots. And everybody does one small task. So first thing what happens is the existing hierarchies don't disappear, but for the sake of the harvest, it disappears. And the second thing is that you know that this small, if say any of us go in there, we have no skills of farming except for those 6 people. We don't, so what job will we be given? Acha, ye aap baandh dijiye, rassi se, ye gatli hai, inko baadhiye. So you're sitting there tying that. Now, when you're tying 200 bundles in a day, you know that this one small task is contributing to the larger harvest at the end. And so, if I can just draw, when people then talk about elections, right? And I talk to the same people, I live in the village when there is an election, when there is no election. I'm interested in what happens to people when the election's finished. Like if you were to go back to UP now. And you know what they say? They said, "Haan." I said, "Ab vote dalte hain, bilkul vote dalte hain. Why won't you vote?" I said, "No, but nahi, is baar nahi vote dal paye," and they are in tears. And you say, "What is there to cry? There'll be another election. You can vote in that." I said, "No, my vote is very important." I said, "Yours is one vote. There are thousands of votes. How does it matter?" They said, "Don't you understand? There are some things where every little individual input is important. It's like when you're trying those things of others. That's how you make something that is not just an aggregate of votes. An election result is not just an aggregate. It is something more. And that is the idea. That is one example of how agrarian life creates democratic values. Sorry, I've run over. Thank you.
अब श्रोताओं की बारी. अब आपके सवाल 3 सवाल करें. चाहते तो हम थे कि और भी ज्यादा वक्त मिले, लेकिन सीमा है समय की. So 3 questions, and ये बोल दें कि आप किनसे करना चाहते हैं. तो नाम बता देंगे तो उनको जवाब देने में सुविधा होगी. फिर they will respond. फिर in the end हम आपको एक कहानी सुनाएंगे. तो 2-3 मिनट उसके लिए भी समय चाहिए.
There's a young woman here.
Let's go.
Hi, this is Sahiti here, and my question is for Mukulika and Namita. This is one of the first panel discussions on agriculture I am listening to, so please bear with me if I make any fault. So I just want to know, you mentioned in your book that in your analysis for your book, you've mentioned 4 realms, and you put one festival name in the religion, and in economics, you have chosen harvest. But I believe in India, harvest is a festival, and festival is harvest. And how did you make that choice? And would you rather, if given a second chance, put harvest in religion and put middlemen, corporates, and markets in economics? And I would like to know your view first, and then Namita's view on the same question. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Good afternoon. It's a very engrossing session, and my wife is, of course, from the village, but I'm not from the village. I'm a village person. But I understand this issue of the form of agitation. One of the takeaway that I noticed, I would like the panel to pay some talk on this, that it has brought all the communities, caste, creed, religions across the country together, which is a very important sign for democracy. So do you really feel that such type of agitations or such type of things should be encouraged, and it should get more coverage across the country, so that you can get the people together away from the caste, creed, religious lines, and democracy can do better. This is my.
Ji. Or any other questions? Yeah, Ji, please.
गुड आफ्टरनून सर। सर मैं खुद एक फार्मिंग फैमिली से आता हूँ, फार्मिंग कम्युनिटी से आता हूँ। सर जब बात चलती है एमएसपी की चलती है, फार्म लॉस की बात चली, अभी हमने डिस्कशन करी इस बारे में, बट सर जो मार्जिनलाइज फार्मर है सर, जिसके पास 2 एकड़ जमीन भी नहीं है, जो उससे भी कम जमीन कर रहा है, पंजाब में हुआ क्या है, वाटर टेबल नीचे जा रहा है, लोगों ने क्या उगाया है, वीट उगाया है, राइस उगाए हैं। मैं गंगानगर से आता हूँ सर, वहां गन्ना उग रहा है। ये सर एक लैंड है गन्ना उगाने के लिए, एमएसपी ने लोगों को दिया क्या है? हमारे लिए पॉलिसी बना रहा है नीति आयोग, वो लोग, उन्हें पता धरातल पे क्या हो रहा है। और सर जो आप कम्युनिटी की बात कर रहे हैं, जो लोग हैं जनरली, वो बिग फार्मिंग कम्युनिटी है, वेस्टर्न यूपी में जाट्स, पंजाब हरियाणा के जट सिक्स, यही डोमिनेट करते आ रहे हैं, पर जो छोटा किसान है उसकी बात कहाँ हो रही है सर?
लास्ट क्वेश्चन है सवाल क्या? जरूर करिए। नहीं, अच्छा चलिए, प्लीज रिस्पॉन्ड। नमिता।
हेलो, I'll take the last question first. जो आप किसान हैं खुद और गन्ने की खेती करने के बारे में आपने कहा, तो marginalized farmers जिसको कहते हैं, जिनकी खेती शायद 1 या 2 एकड़ ही होती है, उनके बारे में कोई सोचता नहीं। हालांकि the reality is that about 80% or more than 80% of farmers in India are small and marginalized farmers. The small farmers are those whose land is less than 2 hectares, and the marginalized farmers are the ones whose land is just 1 or 2 acres. They don't have a voice, and probably the time has come for them to, work in a cooperative manner, form a cooperative. But again, there is a danger of those cooperatives being dominated by bigger farmers. So again, they need to be vigilant about that. And, the cooperative movement itself has to facilitate the voice of the farmers, especially the marginalized farmers. तो मुझे तो यही एक लगता है कि आगे का रास्ता कि कॉपरेटिव्स अगर बनाएंगे, जो छोटे किसान हैं, उससे शायद उनको कुछ फायदा हो सकता है. One big cooperative movement which has really benefited farmers is the one in Kerala. It's done a great, it's been of great benefit to the women farmers there. And I think that a lot of lessons can be learned from that movement. About the castes being brought together, you want to take that up?
Sure, I'll take all of them.
Yeah, okay. About the castes being brought together, the question from the gentleman in the first row here. At the farmers' protest, yes, all the castes did come together. I don't know what the situation is after they've gone back to the villages. On PARI, we published one story recently where we found that the women who participated in these protests, they were very energized by, being part of a revolution, being part of these protests. But after going back to the villages, they feel they now have to go back into the patriarchal setup and, women work in the kitchen kind of attitude, which now they have to deal with. And that has very serious implications on their mental health as well. I think about the harvest as festival and festival as harvest, I'll let Mukulika address that question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Let me take them in reverse order. So the small farmer issue, as we know, MSP is available, it should be available for not just 2 or 3 crops. It's 11 to 13 crops should have MSP. It's just that the government offers it on wheat and paddy, which is why wheat and paddy is grown. The green revolution has turned brown now in all parts of India. The water table has dropped, electricity is expensive, diesel is expensive, submersible pumps have to work longer to pull up the water. We have ruined, this is a conversation about agriculture and man-made climate change. So we have to have a plan of biodiversity. Ukraine's crisis has affected us. Why? Because 80% of India's cooking oil comes from Ukraine. I mean, do we not have the climate to grow sunflowers? What do you think? Sunshine is not something we are lacking in this country. So we have to, this is a much wider, bigger discussion. You're absolutely right. The dominance of the big farmers is, and the dominance of wheat and paddy, but it's absolutely driven by prices and what's happening in agricultural markets. So that's the reform that's required. And I think the Jai Kisan Andolan was pushing back as much on and asking for a rethink of those issues as much as the repeal of the 3 laws. Cross-caste solidarity, yeah, but you know, it's the nature of social movements, it's the nature of events, it's the nature of temporary events that you are able to create cross-caste solidarity. It doesn't happen all the time, but a revolution makes that possible. The nationalist movement brought into the mainstream women, to start with, half the population that was inside the house, and it created friendships across regions, across people that were unprecedented. People discovered each other as Indians during the independence movement. That's where the idea of India was forged. In the same way, yes, there is cross-caste solidarity. I don't think we should always expect that in an unrealistic fashion to remain, with a very important proviso, which links to what Namita was saying about the event question. You know, the event question is the dream question for an anthropologist, because that's exactly what I'm trying. If you say a harvest is like a festival, you've instantly got the point I'm making here, that there are some things that are temporary, that are celebrated, that everybody joins in, that lasts just for a few days. Like the farmers' movement, the protests, it was just one. And we think, okay, so it gave women autonomy, during a harvest, everybody dances together. But what happens afterwards? What is the point? As Namita was saying, patriarchy kicks in. But the point is, society is never going to be the same again. In Europe, during the Second World War, when all the men went away to fight, the women had to run the country. It was the first time that women came out of the home and had jobs. The men came back, they got a nosebleed. Suddenly all their women, rather than sitting at home cooking lunches and dinners and breakfast, were out, they had their own money, they had mobility, they had independence. They never went back fully to the house. So it is the nature of festivals, of events. Jaipur Literature Festival, we are sitting at a festival. We are having extraordinary conversations. It does not mean that once this festival is over, these ideas that we have shared die. That doesn't happen, because what happens? You leave a collective event like this invigorated, enlightened, energized, having made new friends, having talked to people you might not otherwise have talked to. And that is the effect that any festival has on everyday life. That is why one studies events. So when you say a harvest is like a festival, it's not like a festival, it is a festival. And a harvest, but at the heart of it, the harvest is an economic agricultural activity. It's just that when it is special, when you have that relationship between individual input in the way that each of you are listening, talking, raising your hands, responding, that is what making the collective event. So when you have this relationship between your individual input and a collective common good, that is a festival. You can have that in any sphere in life. Thank you.
So this is the relationship between village, peasant and democracy, no? Which we have, you heard and you raised the question. तो मैं अंत में, अब हम अंत की ओर बढ़ रहे हैं, एक आपको छोटी सी कहानी सुनाता हूँ और वो बताएगा कि गांव और डेमोक्रेसी का कितना गहरा संबंध है और किसान और डेमोक्रेसी का कितना गहरा संबंध है। वो डेमोक्रेसी जीता है लेकिन अपने अपने शब्दों में, उसके लिए जनतंत्र शब्द नहीं जानता लेकिन इज्जत शब्द जानता है। वो उसके अपने शब्द हैं जिसमें वो रहता है। तो एक कहानी है, एक गांव में कोरी जाति को जानते होंगे आप, वीवर्स होते हैं, वीवर कम्युनिटी, दोज हु वीव्ड द क्लॉथ्स। तो वीवर कम्युनिटी के एक औरत थी और पति पत्नी दोनों साथ रहते थे। एक दिन और रोज कपड़ा बुनते थे और कपड़े से जो बेच के पैसा मिलता था उससे अपनी जीवन निर्वाह करते थे। एक दिन उन्होंने खूब अच्छा मेहनत किया और ढेर सारा कपड़ा बुना। तो पत्नी ने कहा कि आज तुम जाओ, आज पैसा हम लोगों ने अच्छा कमाया है, बाजार से मीट खरीद के ले आओ, मांस। आज मांस बनाएंगे, खूब अच्छे से खाएंगे और आराम से सोएंगे। वो पति चला गया बाजार, 5 बजे शाम को चला गया। 5 बज गया, 6 बज गया, 7 बज गया, 8 बज गया, 9 बज गया, 10 बज गया, आया नहीं। 11 बजे आता है वो, आया। आके उसने, जैसा गांव में होता है, रात में अंधेरा, कुत्ते सोए रहते हैं रास्ते में, दिए बुझ जाते हैं, तो वो किसी तरह से अपना पहुंचा, घर दरवाजा खटखटाया। पत्नी ने दरवाजा खोला, हाथ मुंह धो करके कहा खाना लाओ। खाना लाया, पत्नी खाना लाई तो रोटी और प्याज। तो उसने कहा कि अरे तुमने आज मीट नहीं बनाया क्या? तो उसने कहा अरे मीट कैसे बनाते, तुम तो मीट लाए ही नहीं। कहा लाए नहीं, मैं तो शाम को 6 बजे ही मीट खरीद के गिद्ध को दे दिया था कि हमारी पत्नी को दे आना। तो उसने कहा मीट खरीद के गिद्ध को दोगे तो हमारे पास पहुंचेगा? गिद्ध तो रास्ते में ही खा जाएगा उसका। तो ये है जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन सिस्टम जो डेमोक्रेसी का है, कि इंटायर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ रिसोर्सेज अगर आप गिद्ध को दे देंगे तो नहीं पहुंचेगा। तो ये विलेज कॉन्शियसनेस है अबाउट डेमोक्रेसी। और
can we end on a slightly more optimistic note? Can I say something small?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल।
That's such a sad note to end our discussion on public distribution system and leakage, right? I mean, that's what your story, it's a wonderful story. Can I, since we have a little bit of time, please, can I say something that leaves us? I've just been talking about how we are invigorated and we leave this session with, and then we go out complete cynics. And Badri's told us the most beautiful story about cynicism. You know, one thing that all of us, you know, this is why are we, I never answered Badri's question when he was saying we don't have words for democracy in, you know, our languages, and how can we say that these are democratic values? I didn't really answer that question. You know, one thing, what we are saying, what Namita and I are saying with our work with farmers is that farmers, because we were talking about vigilance, right? That's one thing a farmer has to be, vigilant. Now, how do we understand democracy through that? All of us think we live in India, it's a democracy, right? We say it without thinking. We think, why do we say that? Because a democracy, we think, is a set of institutions. It's Parliament House, it's elections, there's Supreme Court, there are lower courts. We think democracy is consisted of institutions. But actually, what are those institutions there for? They are to create a democratic culture of how we talk to each other, how we live amongst ourselves. For those institutions which ensure our rights as citizens, we've talked about dissent here, we've talked about Desh Bhakti, we've talked about so many different issues in this festival already. But in order to ensure that our institutions remain the institutions they ought to be, we, each one of us, every single person here, has to be a vigilant citizen like a farmer. And what is the opposite of vigilance? What is the opposite of vigilance? Complacency. It's because we are complacent. We think, election ho raha hai, achhi baat hai, India is such world's largest democracy. We choose our governments through elections. The elections have been distorted, my friends. There is no secret ballot. Did you know that? Every polling booth's results, which is 1,000 voters, is now available to political parties. They know in a population of 1,000 people who is voting for which party. There is no secret ballot. Electoral bonds have made election funding opaque. So we don't know which party has how much money, except we know that 96% of electoral bonds money has gone to one political party. And the Election Commission of India, that so many of us have written books and articles and celebrated across the world, has lost its neutrality. Now, these things are not going to automatically stay. We have to be vigilant. We have to push back. We can't expect democracy. It's not a chair that you bring into the room and put there and say we are a democracy. It is what we create together. Thank you.
तो अब मोकुलिका को मैं इस पर वो करता हूँ और यहीं पे हम लोग इसको समाप्त करेंगे, नहीं तो मैं फिर एक और कहानी सुना देता तो फिर एक और डिस्कोर्स खड़ा हो जाता, तो मैं नहीं करूंगा।
बद्री जी,
लेकिन हम
बद्री जी, सॉरी टू इंटरप्ट, मैं एक
बस
छोटी
2
बात
मिनट
कहना
रह गए
चाहती
हैं,
हूँ।
2 मिनट रह गए।
So I just wanted to add to what Mukulika said, that the farmers' protests have had such an impact, especially in Punjab, from where majority of the farmers were there at the protests, that they have thrown out both the established political parties and given such a thumping majority vote to the AAP. So I think, effectively, if we are united and if we are vigilant, as Mukulika said, then I think we can bring in change. That's all I wanted to add.
तो एक चेंज की परिवर्तन की आशा के साथ, इस नोट के साथ, पॉजिटिव नोट के साथ हम लोग इस सभा को, इस संगोष्ठी को समाप्त करते हैं, लेकिन एक प्रश्न के साथ कि प्रतिरोध ही भविष्य है कि एकोमोडेशन का रास्ता जो चल रहा है वो जिएगा, कौन जिएगा, प्रतिरोध की एकोमोडेशन। और इस फिर एक नोट है जिस पर मुकुलिका कुछ कह सकती है मुझे लगता है, लेकिन हम मिलते रहेंगे फिर अगले सेशन में और ये सारे सवाल कई सेशंस में इवॉल्व होते रहेंगे। धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Mukulika Banerjee, Namita Waikar, and Badri Narayan ji. And we thank Escorts for their support. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience.